Hello and welcome back to A Better World. This is your host, Mitchell J. Rabin, and I'm very glad you're joining us again today. I've invited back David Katzmeyer, who is a longtime friend and colleague who has developed something that I want to really focus in on today called KalaRhythms. It's nothing short of a brilliant system of understanding national and worldly / global rhythms as they apply to the state of the world, if you will, historically, and interestingly, also the future. So we're going to be taking a look at the way these work, the different energies involved in them, and we're going to take a look at what he feels based on this system of KalaRhythms is happening in the relatively near future that he thinks, and so do I, that we all really need to know. So Dave Katzmeyer, welcome back to A Better World. Good to have you.
Great to be back on A Better World, Mitchell. We've had discussions before about the cycles of time and how they relate to nations.
I want you to first give an overview of what is KalaRhythms. Our audience may or may not have seen prior interviews we've done over the course of time, no pun intended, and so they need to understand the different strains, threads, if you will, that run through forming the graphs that you have, so intelligently put together that foretell what can be coming up in the future.
KalaRhythms are the internal rhythms of a living system. Now, one form of KalaRhythms has been made familiar to us on a popular scale, particularly since the late 60s and the 1970s, and those are biorhythms. Biorhythms is a set of internal ups and downs, a clockwork of cycles in our bodies that begin from the day of birth, and they move through consistent, periodic highs and lows throughout our life. These rhythms are simply named the physical cycle, the emotional cycle, and the intellectual cycle. It's quite interesting how they were discovered because they were discovered by more than one person over time, going back to professors in the 19th century. And people got together, and college professors noticed academic differences in the intellectual cycle of their students. Well, people got together, compared notes, and through it all, when you research biorhythms, you find that there is a consistent physical cycle that goes up and down in physical energy every 23 days in our bodies. There's also an emotional wave in how we feel. And this is highs and lows of energy that are going from time of birth. And that is every 28 days. Finally, there is an intellectual cycle. Some days we just seem to have more intellectual energy than others because of a consistent wave moving up and down of 33 days. So here we have three different cycles within the one self, a physical cycle of 23 days, high and low, an emotional cycle of 28 days, highs and lows, and an intellectual cycle moving up and down on a 33-day cycle. So as we go through our life, we may find that some days that we feel more energetic, we want to go for a jog. Or other days, we just want to sit back on the couch, click on the television. Well, these are physical highs and lows. And sports trainers use these often. They're training a runner or if they're training a boxer. If that prodigy is going to develop new ground, run that little extra half mile or something, or work out a little longer. You want to do that during your physical high. But during the physical low, it's not a good idea to take on new ground. Just maintain the progress that you've made. Don't try to push for greater heights then. Wait to the next cycle, because then you're going with the currents of your body.
Now, with nature as well. And
yeah,
all of this, of course, is based on cycles that we've seen in nature. But how did these particular cycles and their duration come about? Who discovered those? That
Let me
one is
share a screen.
3 days, one is 28, and one is 33.
Very good. Let me share a screen with you. This is a common question. People like to know this. This is KalaRhythms.org, KALA rhythms.org. There's a link for biorhythms. So starting out as something rather tangible and widely recognized, although some people believe this is a pseudoscience, unproven, many do accept it as real. Now, biorhythms are, they show our physical, emotional, intellectual energies that move in rhythm. The theory of biorhythms holds that we move in rhythmic undulations of change that begin at birth. Separate and coexisting cycles then influence our energies with a clockwork of change. We have a 23-day cycle, 28-day cycle, and a 33-day cycle. In each cycle, half the time is high and half the time is low. But how did they come about? Circadian rhythms. Circadian rhythms are cycles that last about a day. I mean, you break down the word circa, meaning circle, and dia from diem, which means day. Cycles that last about a day. These are recognized in the medical community and play a role in treating patients and so forth. But we're going beyond a day with the biorhythms because we're talking about cycles that last over a period of weeks. All right, so let's go back in time a little bit. 19th century, Dr. Hermann Swoboda. He was a professor of psychology at the University of Vienna, and he researched periodic variations in rhythmic change in mood and health. Well, he concluded that there was a 23-day physical cycle and a 28-day emotional cycle. He published a paper on that in 1900. Okay, so there we have two cycles discovered by one man, a doctor. Let's go on to Dr. Wilhelm Fleiss. He made groundbreaking discoveries and was elected president of the Germany Academy of Sciences in 1910. His conclusions also confirmed the existence of a 23-day and 28-day cycles within us. Now, this is independent discovery, so let's go on beyond that.
So they did not know of each other's work.
No, I do not believe they knew of each other's work. And this is independent observation. But that's two of the cycles. Now, as for the third, we come into the 20th century with Dr. Rexford Hersey and Dr. Michael John Bennett. They conducted similar research between 1928 and 1932 and came to a similar conclusion independent of any knowledge of Tesler's work. Well, let's go back to Tesla. He was a Viennese engineer mathematician at the University of Innsbruck who noticed that his students had good days and bad days that followed a 33-day pattern, hence a 33-day intellectual cycle. In his many tests of scholastic performance of the high school students in the 1920s, he found periods in which students could relatively grasp and absorb new subjects with mental agility and comparable periods in which the student lacked the capacity to think as quickly and clearly. And so
there's something in the Austrian water. Something's
maybe
going on
so
here in Innsbruck and Vienna that is not happening in the rest of the world, Dave.
Maybe there was a monthly pattern in industrial waste being dumped upstream. Who knows? I don't know. But in any case, when Dr. Rexford Hersey and Dr. Michael John Bennett made their discoveries, they didn't know of Tesler's work, and they came to similar conclusions. Well, there was a book
sort of argues for the notion of morphogenetic fields that Rupert Sheldrake, British biologist, talks about, that there's information in the field that is able to fertilize people, minds, psyches that are in otherwise geographically entirely separate parts of the world, or species for that matter.
That's right. And it can, a morphogenetic field, it can be around an individual, it can be around a group, perhaps even around a species, and even the entire Earth. You know, we have a fractal relationship. What is here is elsewhere, and what you find small, you can find large.
Well, his original study, I believe, had to do with monkeys on some Japanese islands that were peeling potatoes. One started, monkey see, monkey do, the others followed on that island. And in short order, they were doing the same thing on the other islands without any physical contact between them.
The 100th monkey syndrome. It was interesting because they
Yeah,
would pull the potatoes out of the earth and it would be sandy soil and they would be gritty in their teeth. They didn't like that.
that's
There
right.
happened to be a group of observers on this like archipelago, and they were stationed on different islands. Well, uh, on the one island, they just happened to be watching the monkeys when this one monkey got the good idea. Let's take this potato
Awesome.
down to the water's edge.
Right.
And it cleaned it off and it did. And so another monkey saw him do it. And so monkey see, monkey do, the monkey learned and did it. And then a couple of more. And so they all started to learn by watching the other monkeys that they had a much more pleasant meal out of the potato. By the time, now, none of the monkeys were doing this on any of the islands. We were just lucky that we had observers there when this started. By the time the 100th monkey on this island was taking their potatoes to the water's edge and washing them, all of the monkeys on all of the other islands were doing the same thing because, the researchers over there started saying, hey, the monkeys are starting to wash their potatoes. And then the researchers all got together and then they found what happened. And so that's coined the term, the 100th monkey syndrome. So there is a collective consciousness. Let's go beyond collective unconscious in Jungian theory. Let's go to the collective conscious, the morphogenetic field. And so this is where we take it from the species or the group, I mean, from the individual and the group, and take it to the species. So, and there's different things like that. And there's some wonderful story um, told by William James, the American author, who um, tells a story about why he thinks this is true in human life, but that would take time. And suffice it to say that there is a morphogenetic field, and
I
in
just
that
wanted to
field,
bring that aspect up in light of the whole larger picture regarding circadian rhythms and the transfer of information between beings of a given
yes,
species and or between them that we are
this
not
serves,
so familiar with.
yes, certainly, and it serves as a great premise that there is. Let me stop share. This serves as a great premise that there is a collective energy and everything like that. I mean, sure, we have mass industrialization, but you may find that some trends of clothing in Bangor, Maine are coming out at the same time as they are in Albuquerque, New Mexico, because we are living with a mass energy, a mass consciousness, music, style in cars, trends in literature. They're all happening across the entire nation, even before we had instant connections and everything like that. Goes throughout the history of the country.
But let's get
So,
back
what?
to calorhythms here. You
Yeah,
outlined a good history of the narrative involving why we believe that one cycle is 23, another 28, and 133. There are historical antecedents by well studied physicians and professors. And so it seems like there's a fair amount of consensus. We don't understand exactly beyond observation they made of their students, but that we don't have a biological description of why, but that's okay because it seems like it's happened enough over time to give us a reasonable sense. And I got to say that the work that you have done since the 19th century have has also helped to further confirm and verify and validate these cycles. And that's really the focus of what we want to talk about. But if you would first, Dave, please talk about what happens in a period of time, perhaps longer durations, wherein these different intellectual, emotional, and physical cycles cross over as they're going up and as they're going down, because those points of intersection prove to be critical to the overall value of interpreting the data.
okay. To talk about what happens when they reach certain states, let us first define what the cycles are. This is, in a way, the biorhythms of the United States. So, what do I mean by that? We
or
share
or
screen.
any given locale you decide
Any
to
country.
focus on.
Yeah, we're going to talk in this meeting about cycles of the United States because of what's coming up soon.
Sure.
The United States, in the fractal relationship between a person and a country, I aver that if a person has biorhythms in their body, and a nation is made up of people, then you're going to have a fractal relationship, whereas there are internal rhythms inside the country. The country has biorhythms, as it were, but larger institutions are slower to change. These are not going to change every 23, 28, 33 days. The nation doesn't move that quick. They move over tens of years. We have a cycle of physical energy in the United States lasting 28 years long from when we became a nation. We have an emotional cycle that lasts 36 years between highs and lows, starting from the beginning through to now. And we have an intellectual cycle which lasts 44 years. In the interest of time, I'm not going to focus too much on how I came to them, but I can tell you that the physical cycle of 28 years is linked to the septennial rhythm of cell reproduction in our bodies, which happens every 7 years. So this is a multiple of that. The emotional cycle is based on observation of relationships, emotional relationships and marriages, which is the most prevalent is 9 years, with divorce happening on the 10th year, and other examples. This is a multiple of, again, 4 times, and you have a 36-year cycle. Intellectual cycle seems to be loosely related to the 11.2-year sunspot cycle, and our brains are influenced by electromagnetic energy. This is a multiple of 4 again. And there's more, but I don't want to go into that now because I want to look at what these cycles influence, where we are and where we're going. We see that cycles move high and low. And I want to give a couple of high points of this. What do I mean with a physical cycle in the United States? Well, the physical cycle in the United States influences things like our industrial strength, our readiness and strength of the armed forces. Are we out disco dancing, or are we laid back with more relaxed ballroom dancing or things like that? And how much are we working out and getting physical versus getting out of shape and needing to diet? This rises and falls consistently with the 28-year physical cycle. Emotionally, we look at some of the highs that have gone in American history. And let me go over.
Dave, while you're looking for that, I really want to interject this because it's so impressive that when we can ask all these questions about how did we come up with the cycles and how did you calculate that and all that. But when we take this map, if you will, that you have painstakingly developed over many, many years, and lay it on, in this case, US history, we see that there's this correlation over and over again between the physical cycle and industrial development of military activity. And then we see the cessation of them or the reduction of them during low cycles of the physical cycle. And then the same applies to the emotional and the intellectual. So you have proven through these cycles and working with them for so long, a lot of their accuracy, which of course gives us the confidence that what you have to say about it from here on out into the future has a certain serious level of validity. I just wanted to say that so our audience understands the sort of the ramifications of this, I think, incredible work that people really need to know about.
Once you get it and see it, it becomes self-evident. And looking at it in terms of these sine wave charts helps. Like, for instance, up until the 1920s, we had never had a decade since the beginning in which all 3 cycles peaked within a 10-year period. And then came the 1920s. And we know that as the Roaring Twenties. What followed was the first time since the beginning, since we had all three cycles hit the bottom in a 10-year period. And we have a term for that too, the Great Depression. And what we have now is a rising tide, which is going to go into a very interesting decade. In fact, I'm foreseeing the next decade being much better in many ways, like economically and so forth, than it is right now. But we have to cross a bridge to get there. You see, cycles have more to them than just highs and lows. What's interesting about a cycle is when it crosses from a low up into a high, you have a crisis. There will be a brief transition period right there as the country is switching gears, as it were, and anything can happen. Let's take a look. And when it crosses from high to low, you have a crisis. So let's take a look at crossovers. Physical cycles can cause industrial recessions. They can cause prison riots. They can cause acts of violence. They can cause all kinds of things related to anything physical. An emotional crossover can have riots over the Rodney King beating back in 1991, or you can have reactions against anything that the government, the people are upset about with the government. The Watergate affair began with an emotional crossover, and people were very
up or down.
In this case, the cycles were going down, so it was castles crumbling. It was like the end of an era. And so the Nixon administration was facing a heck of a lot of trouble. And even though they had discovered the Watergate break-in in 1972, the year preceding the emotional crossover, it didn't affect his winning the election of 72 by a landslide. Yet the following year, what happens? The cycle's now going down on the downward crossover. Let's have an investigation, and it led to the resignation. Yeah, and because the mood of the nation has changed, and everybody got very irritated over it because they were very upset. So this is emotional. You can have intellectual highs and lows and crossovers. Let's go back to crossovers. This is a conflict of ideas. This is not something that's going to necessarily cause an industrial recession or acts of violence and riots, because it's not physical. This is not something that's going to cause a great emotional turmoil like Watergate or rioting against injustice, such as what happened to Rodney King, or demonstrations all across Alabama after Rosa Parks was refused a seat on a bus. That was another emotional crossover. This is not emotional. This is intellectual, which is a conflict of ideas. And so it's more conceptual. The last time that the intellectual cycle crossed over was in 1995. Let me see here. And we have a chart here. You go to the homepage and you can just scroll forward and you can see where everything is. So we had an upward crossover in 1995. And what happened? The federal government was shut down in disputes over the budget. And because there was, a bill passed, you're supposed to not outspend more than the government brings in. And there was a conflict over it. It didn't happen. Two parties argued. And they say, well, we're shutting down the government until we come to an agreement on how to continue. So this was a policy conflict. This was a conflict of decision. It was conceptual. All right, let's follow this green 44-year intellectual cycle up to the peak and back down to the year 2017. Now it's crossing down. The next intellectual crossover. What happened? Well, the government shut down over a dispute over the budget. Again, the government was outspending what it was taking in. Parties disputed, and the government shut down. And they said, we're going to stay shut down until we come to an agreement. It was a conflict. So the first and second times the government was ever shut down was during an intellectual crossover. It's very interesting that they happen exactly 22 years apart.
Yeah.
So you can see how these cycles come into play.
Right.
And they work together. Well, they're very powerful, and you can see how they work together. When they're all high, you have the Roaring Twenties, all low, the Great Depression, and we're rising up now. So we talked about a crossover bringing about trouble. There have been three times, and only three times in our history, when two cycles crossed over at the same year. Just mathematically, that's going to happen every now and then. The first time that happened was when the gay 90s ended with the tumultuous downward double crossover of the then high physical cycle. It was a boom for industry, and the then high emotional cycle, which was a very much a heyday and coming out from the Victorian era and bright colors and bicycles built for two and open courtship being accepted and Victorian houses and architecture be painted with bright colors. And it was a very emotional time. Good for the arts, for artists and music. But in 1901, which is from the spring of 1901 to 1902, this is tropical year, cycles, our nature doesn't care about our calendars. The beginning of the year is the first day of spring.
Right.
So from spring of 1901 to 1902, we had a double downward crossover, and two cycles crossing over at the same time is more than twice the trouble of a single cycle crossing down. What happened during that time? President
This was the
McKinley.
physical and emotional cycle crossing down.
That is correct. And those two being high is what gave us the gay 90s. And as they crossed down, the President McKinley, was shot and killed. That's what put Teddy Roosevelt succeeded to the presidency.
Mm-hmm.
And the cycles go down. You enter into an era of reform when you look back on when they were high and you reform what was going on. And this is when we started having a shakeup of the huge trusts and monopolies, and they were losing control. And these industries like copper, sugar, meat, tobacco, and oil, and stock prices fell. It's known as the Panic of 1901. And what happened with that financial collapse? It became so bad that it threatened to bring about the collapse of the entire banking system in the United States. This collapse in 1901 doesn't have the reputation of 1929 because we didn't have as much news coverage and everything that's going on. And 1929 was worse. But before then, this was the biggest economic collapse that we had. And
Very interesting because it's really, as you say, not really known publicly in any kind of, significant way. I mean,
that's right. It does not have the reputation.
I'm not an economics historian, but
yes,
it is interesting that according to KalaRhythms, it was as consequential just about as 1929, 2008, and we're heading toward something else that we want to ask you about here.
Well, it's not because of the wording. I'm going to say not because of KalaRhythms, because don't take my word for it. Read history. Go into what was happening in 1901 and 1902 and learn about the Panic of 1901. Research that, and you'll find out how devastating it was and how much of an impact it had on breaking up the big trusts and the monopolies. And that's when the muckrakers came in. And I'll tell you, they didn't have the power that they did anymore after that.
Your analysis of U.S. history has brought this up to another level of understanding and scrutiny. That's what. And it's also interesting to note that just a dozen years later, there was the upsurge of what became the Federal Reserve Act.
1913.
Entire revolution, really, technically speaking, in the banking system because of the Federal Reserve Bank.
And that's when the intellectual cycle had already crossed up high after 1907. It was high, and in the first quarter of creating precedents, that's when you have new beginnings. And in 1913, we had the Federal Reserve Bank Act, and this led to the Federal Reserve Bank. And this is when you create things new as the cycle enters the high again, as you see here with the screen line indicating the position of the 44-year intellectual cycle. And when we go up to the 20s, all these cycles were high, leading to and in the 1920s. And in 1928, the emotional cycle hit a peak, and speculation in the market went wild. And the market was doing very well because industry was expanding, and stocks were doing very well in the intellectual high. And so you had an attitude that not only could anyone make a profit in the market, but a person should make a profit in the stock market. Everybody thought they couldn't lose. They overspeculated during the high. And just then, the following year, 1929, was the second year that we had a double downward crossover. Two cycles, the physical cycle and the intellectual cycle, crossed down at the same time, giving us the crash of the market. That's the double crossover that has garnered more fame, particularly because it led to the Great Depression, during which all three cycles hit bottom. This could have been predicted.
Intellectual cycle in 1929.
The intellectual cycle crossed down and went through crisis in 1929. And so that affected banking, commodities, decision making. Industry certainly hit its double crossover. Two cycles crossing over at the same time.
Depression to follow.
And it led to a depression because just before that, as you can see by the red emotional cycle, we were over speculating and people were over invested, and they put everything into winning, believing they could never lose. And that was foolish. We had out speculated our strength and our sense. Then the rug was pulled out from underneath of us. And if you were living in 1929 and you saw this chart and you saw how everybody was going overboard, you could have predicted that the crisis was coming. You could have predicted it.
Yes.
And that's a point I want to come back to. One last one.
Good.
1973, during the 60s, the emotional cycle was very high. Hey, ever hear of Beatlemania? Hey, ever hear of hippies, the mod era, groovy man, wild colors, pop art, Andy Warhol, yay, jet set, mod, baby. And the intellectual cycle high. SAT scores hit a new peak. We elected an intellectual from Massachusetts to be president, John Kennedy. And we were just expounding in the arts and literature and poetry. Everybody was into something and sharing interests and everything like that. What an intellectual and emotional burgeoning it was during that time, until it came to an end in 1973 with the double downward crossover of the emotional and the intellectual cycles, giving us what? A double, nay, a triple, if you will. A lot of things happened. The Watergate affair that we mentioned led to the resignations of the vice president, most of the cabinet, and then and this is a term, the recession of 1973-74 brought the worst stock market drop since 1929. Oh, wait a minute. This was the worst stock drop since 1929. What was that? Well, that was the double crossover before that. And that was the worst economic crisis since when? 1901, which was the double crossover before that. Are we seeing a pattern here? We're seeing a cycle going on.
Yes.
Now, as if the stock market disaster wasn't enough, and the cabinet resigning and the Watergate affair leading to the resignation of the president, how about let's throw this in, the oil crisis. That's when the prices started going way high, and people like me were waiting in lines in order to get gas because we're having oil prices, stock drop, presidential resignation, all during the crossover, 73 and 74. This is what happens. This is the power of two cycles crossing over at the same time. More than twice the trouble of a single crisis. Two crises happening at once are more than twice as bad. Mm-hmm. Why am I focusing on this part of the cycle? Because coming up in our near future, we have the fourth double crossover hitting us in spring of 2027 until the spring of 2028. Right now, all three cycles are low. The physical cycle is low, but rising. The emotional cycle is low, but rising. And the intellectual cycle is low and declining. However, this three-way low is going to end. We're recording this in December of 2024, and this is going to end in the spring of 2027 when two cycles, the physical cycle and the emotional cycle, cross up. And that is going to have a tumultuous effect with the physical energy, this is going to have people come out of the sedentary state and be brought into action. But while they're doing that, while they're being suddenly thrust into action, they're going to be agitated because the emotional cycle is crossing over, bringing us to a very bad day. So we are going to react while we're in a very bad mood. What this can amount to,
and a physical cycle also on the upswing.
that's one of the cycles crossing over. So they're both going to become high at the same time. So cycles don't just rise their energy all the way from low to high. When they cross that midpoint and break through from the low half into the high, they do so with birth pangs. It is always birth pangs, a crisis. And we're going to have a double crisis, which means that people are going to be reacting. I am expecting rioting in the streets. When we look at what's going on right now, in general, there's some of the things that we can see are going to be what is the focus of this. So we're not going to be a rebel without a cause. We're going to be a mood looking for a reason, and the reason is going to, the clues are around us now.
For instance, taking a look at even the recent event of a CEO of the largest insurance company getting shot in the back, and what's so much behind that is a collective anger, talk about collective, behind the oppression of people and their medical needs that are not being met on a large scale. The amount of support this fellow, a murderer, has gotten is somewhat, exemplary. I'm gathering. I'd like to hear what you have to say.
You're going to see probably a lot of anger at Big Pharma when you look at some of the jacked up prices of medications that people need to survive on, and some of the prices on medications that are needed here compared to the prices of the same medications in Europe. It's like many, many times more.
But this is the point being, Dave, that I hear you saying is that it's this kind of clarity about the oppression, honestly, of people, that we've been, in a sense, programmed to think that this is the way it is and the way it should be. So there's going to be a rebellion against authority at base, at core, happening, starting in this, not starting, but being massively upticked in the spring of 20.
I expect to see a great reaction against a revolt of losing of rights. There have been countless YouTube channels that were terminated because YouTube didn't agree with the opinions of the person who had the channel. And just for having opinions, they would get canceled. There was, of course, the infamous case of the IRS being weaponized against people because of their political views. And they would get audited and repeatedly. I know one person in Ohio personally who was audited 4 times because of his political opinions. And
that's exactly the kind of thing. So so you think that it's largely political, economic, I'm using the word oppression in the larger sense that there are a small few that are prospering even during times like COVID, where many billionaires doubled their revenue, doubled their profit, and most people went lower economically. So is this the kind of thing that we're putting our finger on the pulse of that is going to lead to that upsurge of upset in 2027 spring?
I think there will likely to be a revolt against the top echelon making huge profits at the expense of everyday people. And I think it's going to be against pharmaceutical companies. I think there's some big businesses that are going to be in a lot of trouble. So there's going to be revolt against big business, revolt against political decisions. And look at how the two parties are divided as much now, I think more than they ever have been since the Civil War. And so we have a new administration that's coming in, is going to change things, and we're going to have Doge, and there's going to be a reduction in the government, which is in the cycles, by the way, with the intellectual cycle being low, that's calling for a reduction. That's consistent with the cycles, but there's going to be
That might be
reactions to that.
consistent also with this particular president coming on board.
It's a time of reform. When you have a cycle that enters into the low half and goes into what's called the third quarter, then you have a period of reform. And we have that now here. And that means take a look back and reform, adjust, and downsize. And that's what happens as you go down in the cycle. And so there's going to be reactions against that. Now, here's one dreaded thought. There have been 2 assassination attempts against Trump already that we know of. And I actually believe that there are more that were thwarted, but we know of 2. And there's likely to be more assassination attempts during his presidency, and he's at high risk of actually being killed. If that happens during or before the 2027 crossover, you are going to see rioting in the streets. You're going to see people of both camps coming out and reacting. I mean, it's going to be like having the JDL hold a parade the same day as a Nazi rally on the same street, you know. And I'm not saying that JDL relates to one party or the other. The Nazi party relates to one party or another. I'm just saying that I'm going to give an example of 2 extremely opposing. I could say JDL versus Hamas, you know, and so we are going to see an emotional reaction. We are going to see the biggest upset that we have seen since 1973, and it's less than 2.5 years away. And so I'm sounding the alarm now. I was invited to attend the Science Cycle Summit held by the Foundation for the Study of Cycles a couple of years ago, and I was interviewed. That's up on the archives on their website. And we've done our interviews, and I'm sounding the alarm now. I want people to know that this is coming. A crisis in a crossover in a nation that lasts for a period of 1 year. And so whatever happens, the worst of it is going to happen from spring of 2027 to spring of 2028. But it is coming, be sure. People are going to react to the lack of a national identity. We got the WEF, we got the WHO. These global organizations are doing away with national identities and having us dissolve into a one global government. You're going to see, I believe, a resistance against that among people here in the United States, is saying that we want to have nationalism. You will see a rise of nationalism beginning in 2027 and resisting the global state.
Interesting. Okay, you really put your finger on something very specific with that. And I think that that's happening and has been happening for a while. But what I hear you saying is that it will be reaching a crescendo in the spring of 2027 and carrying on. So one last question, if you would, after the spring of 2028, what are we looking at it from the point of view of the cycles?
Groovy time, man. Let's take a look.
Back to the 60s? What do you mean?
Not quite, but in some ways. If you look at this chart here, let me blow it up and let's take a look. 2030 to 2040. You see this blue line represents the high and rising physical cycle that's going to peak in 2034.
Yeah.
And the high and rising emotional cycle that's going to peak in 2036. This double peak of physical and emotional energies is going to be, well, the last time you had something similar to that was during the gay 90s, which was a jubilant time. It was like really fun. The intellectual cycle is low, but it'll be rising. During this time of rising, that's when you abandon the past, which you do after the cycle bottoms, and you experiment in the avant-garde and reach for out with experimentation. So this is this combined with the physical high is going to bring about a lot of innovation in the sciences. Watch for the sciences in the 2030s. Watch for Mars landings of one type or another. And it's also going to be a very emotional time. And this is going to be a rise in femininity. Because here's something interesting. The physical cycle influences masculine energy, and that's going to be high and rising. The emotional cycle influences feminine energy, and that's going to be high and rising. The intellectual cycle is neither masculine or feminine because intelligence has no gender. But speaking of gender, and this is going to be a good time in the 2030s. I'm really excited and looking forward to. But in 2027, here's another thing that's going to explode. The
Mm-hmm.
whole thing about gender identity, the LGBTQ movement, how many genders are there, operations on children to change their sexes, that is going to blow up like 1,000 tons of dynamite. That is going to be such a revolt against transgenderism, and the way
Oh,
it's
so you don't
being
mean the
considered.
multiplying of transgenderism, but rather a reaction against the phenomenon.
Yeah, yeah, again against it,
Okay.
because they're going to say, you can't teach this to kids. You can't allow them to have operations, and the parents are not to be notified. You can't distort the culture like this, and that's going to be the argument. And
I guess
so
that
with
figures into also the idea of identity,
yeah, that's right. So you're going to and what's going
national
to
and personal, right?
yes, and you're going to see men come out and say, being masculine is not toxic. I'm not toxic because I'm a male. And women are going to say, you know what? I'm not going to have a double mastectomy and start taking male hormones because I'm a woman. People are going to be more masculine and more feminine at the same time. They're both going to crash up into becoming high and more identified, and they're going to say, stop blurring the lines. There is such a
So
thing as a
interesting.
man or a woman.
It's sort of like nature balancing itself out after a period of chaos and confusion.
And therein you have homeostasis, which is why we have undulating cycles in the first place. So if you pick any spot on Earth and say, what is the average lumination? How much light is there at this spot at any one time? Whether you would take in how much light is all day long and how much light is all night long, and you could average out and come up with. So it hovers between light and dark, between that average light point. And there you have homeostasis undulating between the two extremes and polarities against the middle. And that's what a cycle is.
So let
So
me ask
what
you,
you're
I
going to see now
actually
is,
two other questions.
yeah.
Looking through to the future of 2028, pretty much and forward, I would like to ask you about on the political side, autocracy and what and democracy and that polarity and what you foresee based on the cycles happens there. And number two, the question about AI. You said there will be an uptick in technology and the like. And I wonder what role, if any, that you can see through this lens relates to AI and its uptick.
So, okay, political versus and then AI. Politically, I believe that Trump's ideological model might be functioning more of a hierarchy, and that he functions sort of like a military flow chart, with himself being at the top. Well, that's what the president is, as opposed to being a polycephalous network of um, different cells interacting with each other like a molecule. He's not like that. He's
Or like a democracy.
more like a democratic republic, and so I think his is more of a military flowchart sort of thing, and that the cycles are going to be conducive to him being successful in that model. And I believe that people are going to accept that, because of where the cycles are going, and they're going to be accepting of that for the next decade and a half. And
Decade and a half. So after his administration, if it goes to 2028, or yeah, then you see that same. I'm using the word autocratic. You're using the word hierarchic. Will continue for the next decade thereafter.
I believe it'll continue after the election of 2028. There's limits to how much a president can have autocracy because of the checks and balances that we have, the three houses of government. And there's going to be not 100% agreement within his party with all of his policies. There's an opposing party, and where some will agree with him, most of them will not. And so, but I do think that you will see more of a return to a hierarchical military type of political structure in the model. But I'm talking about in comparison to what it is now. There's a limit to how far that could be in place. And I don't know how far the president would want that in place, but we're going to see all of this play out before us, and it'll be consistent. And the 2030s as a whole will be consistent towards that model. The first time you're going to see a downturn and a change of that would start in 2041. And then you start seeing some reforms. In the meantime, don't look for reforms other than cutting back and cutting out. There are people that are going to lose their jobs, a great many, and there are employees that are going to be let go because the number of employees in different agencies are going to be cut out, and you may even see entire agencies cut out by DOGE, and that's coming. Now,
It
in
sounds
AI,
like this is also portending a loss of jobs in the private sector as well, based on my other question about the what might be the prominence of AI.
now, the question that people have been asking now, will AI replace people's jobs? This reminds me of what I used to hear in the 60s when computers were developing. We were projecting what is going to be the future as we make computers more prevalent. And people were saying, well, the computers are going to replace this job and replace that job. And in many cases, it did. But at the same time, the computer industry created far more jobs than it ever uh,
Replaced.
replaced. And so now in AI, I believe that may hold true as well. I'm not afraid about the number of jobs with AI, but it is a bit staggering for the imagination to conceive how effective and how powerful AI can be. Let's take a look at warfare, for instance. We have drones that are basically unmanned aircraft that are capable of targeting and bombing locations. So, what if we have robotic armies, self driven tanks, and the Air Force is unmanned? We will have machines fighting against machines, and with AI, they will be controlled by machines. No humans involved. They'll be sitting back in swivel chairs. And so it's going to be who can build the best machine. AI will make that possible. And in our everyday lives, what about our privacy? I mean, AI can scan texts and phone calls and your web
Eyeballs.
activity, far advanced than had been made possible before. And one of the other things I think that the 2027 crisis is going to bring about is a revolt against our having privacy, the loss of it. And so AI is going to make that far more possible. So can it be used as a tool to threaten our freedoms? Because when you control the information, to some extent, you can control the people. These are key questions that we're going to have to ask, and I don't know the answers to them yet.
Well, this has been brilliant. I totally appreciate it. Stimulating and portentous. So I'm really glad you have used your knowledge and experience, Dave, with KalaRhythms and the way you've cultivated it over time to show us, give us a window into the future. And I really think historically it shows that it has real validity and it's something we need to set up and pay real attention to. So I really want to encourage you all to go to David Katzmeyer's website, KalaRhythms.com, and study it. And you'll be studying yourself at the same time. So, Dave, thanks so much for joining me again today on A Better World. It's been a whirlwind of information. And truly
Thanks
appreciate
for helping to be a vessel for getting out the word of the coming crisis of 2027. And I'm glad we can get the word out through a better world. But the crisis will pass and we will go on. It's not the end of anything.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah.
Thanks so much for joining us, everyone. This is Mitchell J. Rabin for A Better World, and I look forward to seeing you all